There is a specific kind of pain that does not come from being hit or screamed at. It comes from being looked through, from sitting at the dinner table and saying something and no one responds, from running to a parent after something exciting happened at school and being met with a distracted, uh-huh, and eyes that never leave the screen. This is not dramatic abuse. It does not leave visible marks, but psychologically it leaves some of the deepest imprints a childhood can produce. When we talk about childhood neglect, most people picture a child who is physically uncared for, dirty clothes, no food, no shelter. But emotional neglect is far more common, far more socially invisible, and in many ways, far more confusing for the child experiencing it. Because when a child is emotionally ignored, there is no clear event they can point to and say, that was wrong. Instead, they grow up with a quiet, persistent feeling that something is wrong with them. To understand why this happens, you need to understand how a child's brain actually develops. From birth, a child is not just absorbing information about the world, they are absorbing information about themselves, based entirely on how the people around them respond to them. When a baby cries and a parent comes, the baby's brain registers, my needs matter. When a toddler laughs and a parent laughs back, the brain registers, my emotions are real and worth sharing. This process, which psychologists call attunement, is not optional. It is how a child builds the basic architecture of their inner world. When a caregiver is consistently emotionally absent, not necessarily cruel, just unavailable, distracted, dismissive, or simply not there in any meaningful emotional sense, the child's brain does not get those signals, and the child does not conclude, my parent is unavailable. The child, because they are developmentally incapable of understanding adult limitations, concludes something far more damaging. I am not worth responding to. This is the core wound of the ignored child, not rage, not obvious grief, just a slow, deep belief that their inner life, their feelings, their excitement, their fear, their needs, is fundamentally unimportant. John Bowlby, the British psychiatrist who developed attachment theory in the mid-20th century, spent decades studying what happens when the bond between a child and their caregiver is disrupted. He found that children do not simply adapt and move on, they develop strategies. And those strategies, which help them survive childhood, often become the very things that make adult life harder. A child who is consistently ignored tends to develop what Bowlby and later Mary Ainsworth called an avoidant attachment style. This child learns through repeated experience that expressing needs leads to nowhere, so they stop expressing them. They become unusually self-sufficient for their age. They learn not to cry, not to ask, not to reach out. From the outside, these children can look remarkably mature and independent. Teachers might describe them as easy or self-contained. What is actually happening is that the child has shut down the part of themselves that reaches toward other people, because reaching out has never led to anything reliable. This is not a conscious decision. The child is not thinking, I will become emotionally independent. They are simply doing what any living organism does. They are adapting to their environment. But the cost of that adaptation is significant, because the capacity to reach toward others, to express needs, to accept comfort, that is not a weakness. That is the foundation of every healthy relationship a person will ever have. Take a concrete example. Imagine a child named Sarah. Her mother is not abusive. She provides food, clothing, school supplies, but her mother is emotionally flat, dealing with her own unprocessed depression or stress, and simply does not engage with Sarah's emotional world. When Sarah comes home upset about a fight with a friend, her mother says, you'll be fine, and changes the subject. When Sarah achieves something she's proud of, her mother gives a brief nod and moves on. When Sarah is frightened, she is told not to be dramatic. Over years, Sarah learns to process everything internally. She becomes good at it, actually. She develops a kind of self-reliance that looks like strength, But underneath it, she has never learned that her emotions are valid, that other people are safe to turn to, or that asking for help is an acceptable thing to do. She reaches adulthood with the emotional vocabulary of someone who has spent their whole life translating their own feelings into a language no one ever taught them to read. This is where the long-term consequences become visible. Research consistently shows that adults who experienced emotional neglect in childhood, the kind that comes from being ignored rather than abused, show higher rates of anxiety, depression, and difficulties in relationships. But the way those difficulties show up is often subtle enough that the person themselves does not connect them to their childhood. They may find intimacy deeply uncomfortable, not because they do not want closeness, but because closeness requires vulnerability, and vulnerability was never safe. They may find themselves drawn to emotionally unavailable partners, not because they enjoy the pain, but because unavailability feels familiar. It matches the emotional template they built in childhood. They may be extremely competent in professional settings and completely at a loss in emotional ones. They may have a persistent, vague sense of emptiness that they cannot name or explain. The psychologist Jonas Webb, who has written extensively on childhood emotional neglect, describes this emptiness as a kind of emotional numbness, a disconnection from one's own internal experience. The child who learned to suppress their feelings does not suddenly rediscover them in adulthood. Instead, they often live with a sense that something is missing, that other people seem to experience life more fully, that they are somehow on the outside of an emotional world that everyone else seems to have access to. What makes this particularly difficult is that many people who grew up ignored have very little conscious memory of their childhood as being painful. This is different from someone who was verbally abused, who can usually recall specific incidents. For the emotionally neglected child, there is often just nothing, a blankness, an absence of strong memories, good or bad. And that absence itself is part of the damage. Joyful, connected childhoods leave a residue of warmth that people carry forward. The ignored child often carries forward only a kind of neutral fog. It is also worth understanding the role of the parent in this dynamic, not to excuse the harm done, but because understanding it is part of making sense of what happened. Most parents who emotionally ignore their children are not doing it deliberately. They are often people who were themselves ignored, as children, who grew up with the same avoidant template, who learned that emotions are not discussed, that needs are not voiced, that children are to be cared for physically, but not necessarily engaged with emotionally. They pass on not cruelty, but a kind of emotional illiteracy. They give what they were given. This does not make the impact on the child any less real. But it does mean that when adults who grew up ignored try to work through this, they often encounter a specific obstacle. They feel guilty for being hurt by parents who didn't mean to and did their best. This guilt sits on top of the wound and makes it harder to examine. It is worth saying clearly, a parent can love their child and still emotionally neglect them. Both things can be true. Acknowledging the neglect does not require hating the parent. It just requires being honest about what happened. Because honesty is where healing begins. And healing from this particular wound requires something counterintuitive for people who have spent their lives becoming self-sufficient. It requires learning to need people again. In therapy, particularly in approaches like schema therapy, emotionally focused therapy, and internal family systems work, the goal with adults who experienced emotional neglect is not to help them become even more capable of managing alone. It is to help them slowly, carefully, begin to access the part of themselves that they shut down in childhood, the part that reaches towards others, that feels and names emotions, that can receive comfort without immediately deflecting it. This is slow work. It is uncomfortable work. For someone whose entire adaptation was built around not needing, learning to need feels profoundly dangerous. But it is not actually dangerous. It just feels that way because the original learning happened when they were small and had no resources, no alternative, no way to evaluate the situation accurately. The adult in therapy has resources the child never had, and that changes what is possible. What tends to shift gradually is not just how a person relates to others, but how they relate to themselves. The ignored child often grows into an adult who ignores their own interior life, who bypasses their emotions the same way they were bypassed, who pushes through tiredness and sadness and longing without acknowledging any of it. Learning to turn toward yourself, to take your own experience seriously, to treat your own feelings as information worth attending to, this is, in a very real sense, giving yourself what you never received. There is also something important to say about how ignored children sometimes show up in the world in ways that are socially rewarded. The child who suppressed their needs and became unusually independent often grows into an adult who is highly productive, responsible, and reliable. They are often the people everyone counts on, the ones who never ask for help but are always giving it, the ones who seem to have everything together. The cost of this is paid privately and quietly, usually in the form of exhaustion, isolation, or relationships that never quite reach the depth they are capable of. None of this is destiny. The brain remains plastic in ways that matter throughout life. The patterns laid down in childhood are influential, but they are not fixed. People change. People recover. People learn, sometimes painfully and slowly, that they are worth responding to, that their emotions are real, that their needs are legitimate, that reaching towards others is not weakness or futility. But none of that change happens by accident. It requires recognizing the pattern first. It requires being willing to look at the blankness of an emotionally absent childhood and call it what it was. Not catastrophic, not necessarily intentional, but real. And it requires understanding that the self-sufficiency and the quietness and the ability to manage alone were never signs of something missing in you. They were the most intelligent response a child could have made to the environment they were given. The ignored child survived. The work of adulthood is to help them do more than that,